So again, if we compare the alleged Critosaurus dinosaur skull with the horse skull, and we take that front portion off, just like they found the original specimen of this skull in, and again, did they originally restore this looking like a horse skull because they knew it was a horse? Let's talk a little bit about dinosaurs. As I briefly mentioned previously, I really question the validity of dinosaurs. Crazy you may think, but not so if you look back at the evidence, or lack of. So where do I start? I think a good place would be where the word dinosaur originates from. Did you know, for example, that it wasn't even a word before 1842? Richard Owen coined the term dinosauria to describe what he believed were a new type of animal. The word originally meant terrible lizard, which is very interesting considering the evidence that I'm finding in Portland. In the 1800s and before, many finds of large bones and large petrified remains have been discovered all around the world. Archaeologists, paleontologists were starting to ask questions. What caused all these animals to perish in what looks like some disaster event that happened worldwide? So let's take ourselves back to the 1800s, where science was the hot topic of conversations. Darwin was trying to prove evolution right and the Bible wrong, and there were heated discussions from both the church and the evolutionists on how the world was created, whether there was a flood and the Bible is true, and on history itself. For me, this is when they started to attempt to control the information, control what people believe. And I think a massive factor here also, and I do mention it a lot, is the lunatic asylums or mental institutions, as they are more modernly known. We're in an age of a scientific revolution where information and discoveries are abundant, yet on the other hand, going on at exactly the same time, which mainstream scientists, geologists, historians alike fail to point out, is that we have laws and regulations being passed almost yearly, persecuting anyone or any group who says the wrong thing. You had the plantations, the slaves, oppression was abundant. Is it really beyond belief that they could change history relatively easy in this period? When if you question authority, you can be cast as a lunatic or chucked in the workhouse. If we go back to Richard Owen and the 1800s, where he is a known plagiarist. So he steals other people's work and claims it as his own. If we read through an article here which goes into it in a little more detail and some comments from some of his peers at the time. So Owen, the most distinguished vertebrate zoologist and paleontologist, but a most deceitful and odious man. No one fact tells so strongly against Owen as that he has never reared one pupil or follower. Charles Darwin to Asa Gray, 1860. Owen has been described by some as a malicious, dishonest, and hateful individual. He has been described in one biography as being a social experimenter with a penchant for sadism, addicted to controversy, and driven by arrogance and jealousy. Deborah Cadbury stated that Owen possessed an almost fanatical egoism with a callous delight in savaging his critics. Indeed, an Oxford University professor once described Owen as a damned liar. He lied for God and for malice. Gideon Mantle claimed it was a pity a man so talented should be so dastardly and envious. So at the time, in the UK, there is another two people in America who I'll touch on in a bit. But in this country, UK, you had a guy called Gideon Mantle and Richard Owen, and I liken it to the way they've portrayed Tesla and Edison. And so you've got two guys, experts in their field, and Richard Owen is with the Royal Society. So he gets all the publicity, all his work gets put out there. I believe Gideon Mantle founded a museum where he lived, but he was never quite as big, and his work was never put out there quite as much as Richard Owen. And Richard Owen is accused of stealing the majority of Gideon Mantle's work and presenting it as his own. Owen famously credited himself and George Cuvier with the discovery of the iguanodon, completely excluding any credit for the original discoverer of the dinosaur, Gideon Mantell. This was not the first or last time Owen would deliberately claim a discovery as his own, when in fact it was not. It has also been suggested by some authors, including Bill Bryson in A Short History of Nearly Everything, that Owen even used his influence in the Royal Society to ensure that many of Mantell's research papers were never published. Owen was finally dismissed from the Royal Society's Zoological Council for plagiarism. When Mantell suffered an accident that left him permanently crippled, Owen exploited the opportunity by renaming several dinosaurs which had already been named by Mantell, even having the audacity to claim credit for the discovery himself. When Mantell finally died in 1852, an authority carrying no byline derided Mantell as little more than a medicus scientist who brought forth few notable contributions. The authority's authorship was universally attributed to Owen by every geologist. The president of the Geological Society claimed that it speaks of the lamentable coldness of the heart of the writer. Owen was subsequently denied the presidency of the society for his repeated and pointed antagonism towards Gideon Mantell. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what this guy is like and what was going on in the 1800s. Are they just creating a monopoly for the information, very similar to what they've done, what we've, or the British have done with Egypt, where they're steering the narrative in a certain direction and away from the truth, most likely. This is a comment that he allegedly said after he died. Not particularly a nice man. But again, I like a lot of Tesla and Edison. How much is fact and how much is fiction is anybody's guess. Did you know a whole, complete dinosaur skeleton has never been found? What you see in museums and displays are reconstructions from plaster based off a small and sometimes fragments of bones. Hadrosaurus is the most complete skeleton found and was discovered and documented in 1858. Here are some comments from Eric Dubay.
Most people believe that dinosaur skeletons displayed in museums consist of real dinosaur bones. This is not the case. Paleontologist, advisor for Steven Spielberg in the making of Jurassic Park, host of the Discovery Channel's documentaries about dinosaurs, Don Lessam, defends this practice by claiming that dinosaur bones are too rare to put on display. Quote, "In museums, bones are cleaned and cast, and the copies attached to one another to make skeletons. The real bone is too rare to put out on display. The real bones are incarcerated in thick vaults to which only a few select, highly placed researchers hold a key, which means that no independent researcher has ever handled a Tyrannosaurus rex bone. When people unaffiliated with the paleontological establishment attempt to gain access in order to study these dinosaur bones, they are met with refusal upon refusal."
A comment on the paleontology Wikipedia entry says, when trying to explain the past, paleontologists and other historical scientists often construct a set of one or more hypotheses about the causes and then try to look for a smoking gun. A piece of evidence that strongly accords with one hypothesis over any other. And it is generally accepted this was the case. I'm not saying Wikipedia are the gospel of truth. But what this essentially proves is they are coming up with a theory and then trying to find the evidence for it. And if we go back to the Hadrosaurus case again, and again I'll give you an extract from Eric Dubay's really good video, and whereas I don't agree with everything that Eric says in that video, I do believe he brings up some fantastic points, and Eric himself says a lot of the time may, possibly, and points this out himself. Essentially, a lot of this stuff we are working with a clean slate, and it's very hard to find evidence for things when they've quite possibly been wiped. So it's just piecing the puzzle together and seeing if the roads lead to the same conclusion, but at the same time always being open to other avenues. And that's the way research should be done.
Hadrosaurus folki, or simply Hadrosaurus, was the first dinosaur to be publicly displayed. It is also an official symbol of the state of New Jersey. What few Americans are aware of, however, is that its skull caused big problems for the museum director and the leading paleontologists, because there was no skull, the skull being the main evidence for the existence of this creature. A visual and a sculptural artist were promptly hired to invent a skull, and from the illustrations of another artist who had depicted the iguanodon, the two artists drew the same face for the Hadrosaurus folki. The people involved could now technically defend the existence of this dinosaur. If someone were to ask, the stunt worked out so well and fooled the public so thoroughly that they could later change the head of the creature to that of both the Griposaurus and the Brachiosaurus without anyone noticing.
I said I'd give the Americans a quick mention, and the American version of the Owen and Gideon Mantell rivalry was between Nathaniel Marsh and Edward Cope. So the Bone Wars was also known as the Great Dinosaur Rush. It was a period of intense and ruthlessly competitive fossil hunting and discovery during the Gilded Age of American history, marked by a heated rivalry between Edward Drinker Cope, Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, and Nathaniel Charles Marsh of the Peabody Museum of Natural History of Yale. Each of the two paleontologists used underhanded methods to try and outdo the other in the field, resorting to bribery, theft, and the destruction of bones. Each scientist also sought to ruin his rival's reputation and cut off his funding using attacks in scientific publications. Sounds very similar to what was going on in the UK. Their search for fossils led them west to rich bone beds in Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming. From 1872 to 1892, both paleontologists used their wealth and influence to finance their own expeditions and procure services and dinosaur bones from fossil hunters. Cope and Marsh were financially and socially ruined by their attempts to outcompete and disgrace each other, but they made important contributions to science and the field of paleontology and provided substantial material for further work. Both scientists left behind many unopened boxes of fossils after their deaths. So this is another point I wanted to sort of touch on as well. So this was very similar to the case, as I mentioned, of Richard Owen and Gideon Mantell. And in a minute, again, I will show you more proof of this. But so what I believe was going on is you had a couple of people that were designated as the collectors and designated people who were allowed to investigate and look into the fact that these could be dinosaur bones, and I think it was monopolised. So the situation I believe you had in the 19th century was whenever anyone found a bone, and this is the case, or whenever anyone found anything that they didn't recognise in the normal animal kingdom, these guys in America were called, and obviously Richard Owen and Gideon Mantell were called in the UK. So you end up having a situation where these guys will hoard probably 90 to 95% of all the evidence, all the bones, and all the specimens that are found. And here's another clip from Dan from the Archivix channel, where it suggests the Smithsonian Institute also has a big role to play in all this.
This is from 1919, Washington, D.C. as well. London, December 16th. Accompanied by Laddie, a German war dog whom he captured on the Western Front, Captain Lester Stevens will leave London on Christmas Eve for Central Africa in search of the Brontosaurus, a prehistoric monster for possession of which, according to the Daily Mail, the Smithsonian Institute offers $5 million. Now, the Smithsonian has been known from the beginning of its culmination to be offering bounties on a lot of things.
Critosaurus. Critosaurus is an incompletely known genus of hadrosaur duck-billed dinosaur. It lived about 74.5 to 66 million years ago in the late Cretaceous of North America. The name means separated lizard, referring to the arrangement of the cheekbones in an incomplete type skull, but it is often mistranslated as noble lizard in reference to the presumed Roman nose. In the original specimen, the nasal region was fragmented and disarticulated and was originally restored flat. In 1904, Barnum Brown discovered the type specimen of Cretasaurus near the Ojo Alamo Formation, San Juan County, New Mexico, United States, while following up on a previous expedition. Oh, what a coincidence. Barnum Brown is also credited as discovering the T-Rex, just as a bit of useful information as well. But the thing I really wanted to highlight with this discovery is in regards to skull. So this is how the skull has been reconstructed to now, and I believe from reading reports that the whole front portion of the nasal area was not there, so it was reconstructed, and you can see it a lot better in another photo that I'm about to show you. So this is the original construction, and I'm pretty certain I know why they've changed this and added other little details to it, because it looks, it was first thing I thought it was when I saw it was probably exactly what you're thinking: horse. Now you look up a horse skull and it looks very, very similar to a horse skull, but key, and I'll be honest, I have tried to find the dimensions of this skull and it's not easy, and I'll be honest, this part of the video I wanted to make as short as possible, as I wanted to show you the possible deception before I go into the next part, as I believe it's important. But the key thing with this skull compared to with the horse skull that I'm showing you in the background now, which is just a standard horse skull, but the key difference being is the size. So if you're trying to cover up the animals were a lot bigger, and if you remember the article that that Dan showed you before of the archivists, where they were digging up huge horses with saddles the size of dump carts.
Over in 100 feet in a mine shaft at 100, and I think it might have been 120, 130 feet, they found a skeleton of a man. Very unusual skeleton. Considered to be the oldest ever found in America. Over in Calaveras County, huge petrified skeletons of men are said to be quite common. Also, the bones of yet huger animals on which they used to ride, judging from the saddles, as large as dump carts, found still strapped on their backs.
Did they need to come up with an explanation for all these oversized animals? Because if you don't make up another species and subject entirely, people only have what they can see and relate and associate it with, which would be a horse. Also, it puts stuff back in history millions and millions of years. And on that regard as well, realistically, would a skull, after millions of years, still be in a state where you can, unless it was petrified, would it still be in a state where it's still going to be bone? Because these are still bone. So how is that still surviving after millions of years? It would suggest it's more recent, which is very interesting. So if we come down and just read these couple of paragraphs. So when the skull was found, much of the front had either eroded or fragmented, and Brown reconstructed this portion. So the specimen you have here is actually the second reconstruction. So originally it was reconstructed, and that was what it looked like. And as mentioned, it looks very like a horse. And do you think possibly that it was reconstructed like this because they thought it was a horse, and only later, when it fell into other hands, maybe, did they think to reinvent this story? So I have done a couple of images out, and let's have a look at what it could have possibly looked like without the front portion. So before I do that, quickly look at the discoloration here and here. I would have thought, from the looks of it, this whole part here and down here is all reconstruction. So we can assume that most of that part was probably gone. And this was the second reconstruction, where they added the Roman nose feature, which would back up their theories on that particular species of dinosaur, Critosaurus. So what could it have looked like before? So again, if we compare the alleged Critosaurus dinosaur skull with the horse skull, and we take that front portion off, just like they found the original specimen of this skull in, and again, did they originally restore this looking like a horse skull because they knew it was a horse? And I do think this is where the deception comes in, because these can't be the only oversized animals that they were finding. So you have to come up with some other story and make up some other species altogether, or people will start asking questions. Well, how come things were a lot bigger? And it kind of proves, and they obviously had a lot of this evidence in the 19th century, i.e. the 1800s, to deal with, and they had to steer people into another direction. Ichthyosaurus dinosaur skeleton exposed as fake. For 116 years it graced the halls of the National Museum of Wales at Cardiff, the fossilised skeleton of a 200 million year old predator that once cruised the Jurassic Seas. It survived the scrutiny of scientists who had known Charles Darwin and Richard Owen, the Victorian scholar who coined the word dinosaur. It survived revolutions in paleontology, arguments over evolution, and scandals in the world of fossils. Then curators at Cardiff decided the remains of the ocean-going carnivore Ichthyosaurus needed to brush up, and realised that they had been taken. When we stropped off 5 layers of paint, we found it was an elaborate forgery, said Caroline Butler, a conservator. It was an amalgam of 2 types of Ichthyosaurus plus a clever attempt at fake parts. Ichthyosaurs were discovered by fossil collector Mary Anning on the Dorset coast in about 1809. Cardiff specimen was presented by a local businessman, Samuel Allen, in 1884. It will now go back on display as an example of a fake. Museum officials have dubbed it Ichthyosaurus. So, like I mentioned earlier, or like Eric Dubay mentioned in his video earlier, it's very hard for independent researchers or the likes of you or I to ever handle or look at these dinosaur bones, and you have to ask yourself, if some of these other ones were looked at, would it be a similar scenario? And considering the scrutiny it seems that some of these bones and skeletons went through, I think that could highly likely be the case.